Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. This is the 4th of July special. That's why Stacy looks so great wearing red, white, and blue.
Red, white, and blue. And the purple, of course, is the shoes that blends it all together. We're in a purple state here called North Carolina, which is a blending of the Democrats and the Republicans, you know, as we're getting ready for another a year of basically tearing each other apart again. There's not much. We have a lot of independence, but not much cohesion, you might say. The cohesion index is off the charts, as the economists would say. And I want to say we have our new tradition now of having lobster for Independence Day to celebrate America, because U.S. moves to protect lobster industry threatens tariffs on China. I don't know why the tariffs on China, but nevertheless, they're getting blamed for the fact that the pandemic has caused a collapse in consumption of lobster, which all comes from Maine and Canada. But a lot of Canada apparently has some trade deal with Europe, and they've sold more of their lobster to Europe. And so we have an excess of lobster, and we bought some from Maine. It got shipped overnight from Maine. So we're celebrating having some lobster.
Yeah, overnighted lobster from Maine is delicious. And, you know, lobster is just part of this global commodity breakdown. And you look at the commodities. Commodities tell a different story than stock markets and bond markets, right? Stock markets and bond markets respond to money printing in a big way, and not so much in the commodity market. So the oil market, the gold market, the agricultural markets, coffee market, lobster market, like they actually reflect more of the supply and demand of what's really happening around the world. There's more of a price discovery in those markets. Not perfect, but it is better than you find in the financial markets. So the lobster market being disrupted in this way, it kind of shows how you've got these trade wars that were now the consequence of currency wars. Remember, for about 10 to 15 years, it was about a currency war because China pegs its currency to the dollar, and they do so in a way to try to export their way to financial greatness at the expense of America. Then Trump started to question that, and now we're into more of a trade wars. And according to our friend Gerald Celente, of course, currency war leads to trade war, leads to hot war. And, you know, and you see on the periphery, you know, a little hot war happening here and there. So I guess that's where we are in the cycle.
Yeah, and of course, you know, it being Independence Day, we had independence from the British monarchy, from taxation without representation. And now, of course, we've come full circle because we have the taxation without representation, which is the inflation caused by the Federal Reserve Bank. So nobody really understands what it is. It's very well hidden. It's not transparent. We don't know how big their balance sheet is, how much our money is being devalued. But another now canceled founding father, who was George Washington, who, you know, I think we're still allowed to say his name, but nevertheless, he did say that we should trade with all nations, no foreign alliances or entanglements. Like, let's not get involved in other people's wars. Let's not become an empire. And of course, we are here now as an empire. So I think, you know, a lot of people naturally think like, you know, we're number one, which means the elites are number one. You get nothing, because once the elite have an empire, they don't need the domestic population they don't need the consent of the population, because they just plunder from overseas, right? They take the Iraqi oil fields, they take the Libyan oil fields, they take all that stuff and they control and dominate through like the dollar reserve system, and they don't need the people. And you could see that instinctively, you know, maybe we're not articulating it, maybe many people aren't articulating it, but what they feel is they're not needed.
Right, you know, just thinking there when you were talking about the Fed and the inflation and how it's undetectable. It's like, you know, the people who die from gas coming from the oven or a gas leak, because the gas is odorless.
Yes.
And so for safety purposes, they add an odor to the gas so that people would wake up and say, oh my gosh, you know, we're dying because of this gas leak. You know, the Fed should attach an odor to the US dollar so that when it arrives in your paycheck, when you go to the bank and you go to the ATM machine, it should stink really rancidly to alert you to the fact that this is actually debt that's being pumped into the system to debase your livelihood and debase your family and to debase your quality of life and to debase your humanity. It should really stink badly.
And you know how domestically we have so many laws that the average American commits about 4 felonies a day if the government feels, just like the days of the monarchs, you know, capricious enough and feels like on a whim deciding to destroy your life. You see that all the time, and you saw that with the fact that anybody around Trump could be destroyed based on relatively minor procedural thing, right? So the same thing internationally we're seeing, like with this lobster story. It's like we have so many sanctions and so many layers of tariffs and things you're allowed to do and who can't do that and you've crossed this thing. And, you know, there's so many ways to punish people, whether it's in the past we've punished Bank Paribas, all the French banks got billions of dollars of fines on them because they traded with somebody we didn't like, things like that. But again, like once the empire is over, and if you look at Europe, I just mentioned France, like if you look at France and you read the history, the ordinary French peasant, the bottom 99%, lived horribly while they had a huge empire, you know, across the world, much of Africa, and they had a horrible life. Now they have an amazing life. The French person takes like 8 weeks vacation a year. They take the whole summer off. They have second homes. They eat so well. They live well. And that's because the government is afraid of the people. And why are they afraid of the people? Because they now need the consent of the people. So, you know, this is a government we clearly in America no longer, the government doesn't feel like they need the consent of the people.
Right, the people do better if the country that they're living is not an empire.
Yes.
You know, think Dickensian England, of course, happened during the English Empire.
Yes.
Right, so in American slums, they're growing at propitious rates because America empire. Right? Because it's easy for the top to thieve everything and leave nothing for everyone else. So America would be better off if it was not an empire. So the collapse of the US dollar, it will be painful for a period of time, but what comes on the other side will be, I think, a lot more amenable to most people.
Well, if it is amenable, then there's good news in the headlines over the past week because it looks like deglobalization is picking up speed. The volume of world trade plunged a staggering 12.1% in April. On an annualized basis, it has now fallen by $2 trillion in just 1 month, with no V-shaped rebound in sight. There it is, looking pretty bad.
Right, we're heading into a global depression, which, as we are saying here, might be a good thing because values come back. In other words, during a period of global expansion with fiat money, values go out the window, and conspicuous consumption becomes the most obvious way people display their characters to each other. And now in a global depression that we're heading into now, that will be gone, and we have more values. And so people baking more at home, knitting more, crocheting, doing blanket weaving.
Max is just talking about his life over the past 3
lately.
months.
Knitting a huge American flag right now, and macrameing some fresh curtains, right? So, and baking, keto baking, I'm like a freaking expert at these days. So, but that's actually a good thing. You know, people, I think, are more comfortable with a world based on human values than not conspicuous consumption. So it'll be kind of painful for a while, but at the other end of this will be something a lot more humane and enjoyable as humans.
Well, we're going through a puritanical hysteria. America has this often. It's in our, in our DNA. Even newcomers to the country. My family didn't come here until like 1918 and the 1920s. So we're newcomers. Despite that, we're still susceptible to the American thing of having puritanical hysterias every once in a while. And hopefully, that will pass into something better. But in the meantime, we're having this puritanical hysteria and an erasure of memory. But
you came after the Salem witch trials. My family arrived here around the 1730s. And so we were experiencing a lot more of the phases of puritanical hysteria that we experience here in America from time to time, like we're experiencing now. We've become like this whole Karen craze. Karen is a puritanical witch hunter, right? So that's just very American for this type of sudden outpouring of vexing of the situation, and the public Satan expunging, what do you call that? An exorcism, right? So Karen is trying to exorcise the ghost of, Jimmy Carter or something out there in the middle of Whole Foods, clutching the last keto cup. Who knows?
You bring me back to the 60s when we had the last huge uprisings across America. We have the civil rights movement, and we had the exorcism, remember, of the Pentagon. They tried to levitate the Pentagon. I think it was Abby Hoffman led that thing. And that was towards the end of that civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement, I don't think it was an accident that it ended once they started looking at the empire, once Martin Luther King Jr. looked at empire, once Malcolm X was looking at empire, that it wasn't just domestic. You can't just say, oh, we're racist domestically and not look at our footprint internationally and that is racist. So in terms of that, we need to look at the systemic thing, as we've pointed out, the Federal Reserve Bank, but also the US dollar, because to have the US dollar, not only does it disadvantage domestically the population, the bottom 99% who don't get the free money printed first, but it necessitates the exporting, the sending overseas of your jobs. Like, you have to have a way for the rest of the world to get dollars in order to maintain this system. So you have to give them dollars. And the best way to do that is to look at the least able to, represent, with the least agency in the government, in the Federal Reserve, the least power. When they established this system, so they looked at the Rust Belt. Now it used to not be a Rust Belt; it was a flourishing wealth creation machine, and that got shipped overseas because, of course, what that wealth creation machine did is, remember, our wealth and income gap used to be way smaller back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So they saw that, just like a private equity looks at a pension fund held by a company and they think we could take that. That's wealth to be taken. This is the same thing. They looked at that population and said, let's take that, send it overseas. That's a way for them to maintain our empire, that we could send, build these military bases overseas, that we could just secure for the elite, that we could secure our wealth and our fortune.
Right, that wealth and income gap, there's actually a whole science behind it, and they call it the Gini coefficient. And the Gini coefficient's tracked all over the world. And America's Gini coefficient, you can look this up, is gapping wildly, spectacularly, and looking like a terrible situation. But you make an excellent point there that the only way to keep the US dollar as world reserve currency is for American export as jobs, because you need the other countries and other governments create an aggregate demand for dollars.
You need a trade deficit. You
absolutely need a trade deficit for the dollar to be world reserve currency. And so that only benefits, however, the people who are in the debt packaging and debt creation business, and that would only be Wall Street.
And that's why China, everybody gets them wrong. China does not want the world's reserve currency because they see what you have to do to the population, and they're afraid of their population still. And finally, this all ties together of the rise of a new empire who is fighting it because they don't want the world's reserve currency, but White House considers broad federal intervention to secure a 5G future. The Pentagon says whoever owns 5G owns the world, and that's China. So here the Pentagon and the White House want to see, because there are no American companies involved in 5G. They don't build it, they don't manufacture it, and we don't innovate it. So who are they turning to? Ericsson and Nokia, two European companies, is asking them if they will find a way to, their product is like 2 or 3 times the price of Huawei. So they're trying to find a way to make, it possible to introduce it to America.
But wait, those countries are socialist. My mind is blown.
And post-empire.
Wow. Well, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Richard Field. He's the director of the Institute of Financial Transparency, author of Transparency Games: How Bankers Rig the World of Finance. Welcome back, Richard.
Thank you, Max. Thanks for having me back.
This past weekend, the Fed revealed some of the individual corporate bonds they have recently started buying are AT&T, United Health, Comcast, Apple, Walmart, to just name a few. Why is the Fed buying the bonds of these corporate behemoths, Richard?
The Fed is buying those bonds to force investors into buying even junkier credits. What we have going on right now is there's the CLO market that I think you are aware of that has the ultimate junk floating around in it. And the Fed wants to force investors back into buying the CLO offerings. This is all about pushing investors to chase yield.
So it's like reverse drug dealing, isn't it? You know, in drug dealing, they start off with the good stuff and then they add baby laxative or some other thing to stretch it out. Here, it's the Fed, and what we see on Wall Street is they start off with the bad stuff, and they want people to buy the bad stuff because it's insolvent. So many companies in America are insolvent. 20% of them, as a matter of fact, of the S&P 500 are insolvent. So to get them to be attractive to investors, they cut the bad stuff with actual companies that are doing okay. Why does the Fed feel it's necessary to hoodwink America in this way? Why does the Fed feel it's their position to draw money from investors and pensions into a provably, demonstrably rigged game and Ponzi scheme, Richard?
Because all of the banks in America, particularly the too big to fail banks, are all insolvent. If you think about this pandemic and the high unemployment rate we have, and the fact that everybody stayed home to socially distance, that meant that a tremendous number of companies have no revenue. When you have no revenue, you cannot pay your debt. It also meant that there were a lot of individuals who had no income during this period because they were laid off. When you have no income, you also aren't going to pay your debt. So if you're the Fed and you're looking at banks, JP Morgan, Citi, et cetera, what you're seeing is big insolvent entities. So what you're trying to do when you're purchasing the high-grade credits like an Apple credit is force investors to buy the junk that is currently sitting on the balance sheets of these insolvent entities.
So it's misdirection. It's like David Copperfield running Federal Reserve policy. It's a look over here while I make the Statue of Liberty disappear. It's patently dishonest. And, when American empire looks like it's crumbling, a lot of people on the sidelines have to get a big belly laugh out of it because they're obviously it's committing some kind of finance. Let me ask you this. Trump came into office with this MAGA thing, Make America Great Again, and he's getting away from globalism, and yet the Fed is buying junk bonds or bonds from Toyota and Volkswagen. So how does that work?
You got to remember, we still have to bail out some of our allies. And if you look over at Germany, they have this very large insolvent institution named Deutsche Bank. And this is all about helping to bail out Deutsche Bank.
Okay, so it's just quid pro quo, crony capitalism, and fraud. I don't know. I mean, is Trump, I don't know what his payday is for this, or he's just being, made to look.
Oh, no. Go back to the fact that Deutsche Bank is the one who lent him all the money.
Oh, right. All right, right. You're right. That's right. Deutsche Bank is his banker. I forgot. BlackRock, the biggest asset manager in the world, has handed the responsibility of buying assets for the Fed. They're even allowed to buy some of their own assets. How's this going, Richard?
It's the ultimate conflict of interest, is to buy their own assets. With the exchange-traded funds, they create these funds that they put all these lousy bonds in, and then they sell them on to the Fed. It's like if you wanted to have policies that were bad for investors, this is what you do. This way, the only investors who benefit are the BlackRock investors. Anybody who is not a BlackRock investor is screwed over. I mean, if we go back, by the way, to the CARES Act that was passed to deal with the COVID-19, in his signing statement for the act, Trump said, the act requires some de minimis amounts of transparency. We're not going to provide them. So what you see is little peeks into how the money is being spent. And we're talking $2.5 trillion, where the Fed was also going to put in about $4 trillion of leverage. So there's $6 trillion of spending going on. We have no idea really how it's all being spent.
You know, I've seen images of people setting up a guillotine outside Jeff Bezos' house in Washington, D.C. I see a couple standing outside their mansions with assault weapons trying to ward off protesters. In other words, the people aren't fooled by this. They're not fooled by Larry Fink over at BlackRock. They're not fooled by Donald Trump. They're not fooled by Deutsche Bank, Toyota, or Volkswagen, Comcast, Apple, or Walmart, AT&T, or United Health, ripping them off blind, disenfranchising them, stealing their economy, and returning America to a slave economy where everyone is on click farms trying to make Jeff Zuckerberg rich. So, I mean, Mark Zuckerberg.
The rich people all think they can leave before the guillotines really come out, Max. Okay? If you got to look at America right now, there's a book on the New York Times bestseller list by Stephanie Kelton saying that deficits don't matter. The deficit myth, I think is what it's called. And it's this whole idea of modern monetary theory that says the US, as the reserve currency, can effectively print as much money as it wants at this point without triggering inflation. So anything that anybody wants as a program can be funded.
Right, but if deficits don't matter, Richard, how come America can't make 50-cent masks?
We spent the last 40 years, Max, outsourcing our production capacity to
right,
China.
and as a result, we created a dependency on foreign suppliers in a way that has rendered the U.S. Impotent.
Yeah, it hollowed us out. There's no doubt about it. Now, the interesting question is going to be, as a result of all this, do we reinvest in production in the U.S.? Do we bring it back onshore? And if we bring it back onshore, how will it actually look? Will it have robots doing most of the manufacturing, or will it have individuals doing most of the manufacturing? I think you're going to see a world where we're going to bring back a hell of a lot of production, but it's going to be automated. So it's not going to create a lot of jobs. And that's really going to make a lot of people upset.
I think they're already upset. You know, you've got more than 120 million.
Right now, there's a promise of jobs.
Well, we'll see how that goes. So let's discuss the CLO market, the collateralized loan obligation market. It's bigger than the collateralized, the CDO market of 2008. And apparently, variable interest entities are the new special purpose vehicles, or SPVs, companies established by banks to hold off the books positions. What sort of meltdown might we see here? It's just a continuation of all the junk from 2008, rebranded, renamed, repackaged. You know, it's
all of the above. But this time, unlike 2008, where when it imploded, it brought down all of the large banks because they were holding on to this junk. This time, I think they've actually succeeded in packaging it. So what you're going to see blowing up are going to be the insurance firms. You're going to see people's pension funds blowing up. Those are the ones who are really holding the toxic pieces of the CLO market. The CLO market also doesn't have as much in the way of the derivative type bets going on that the CDO market had in 2008. So there's not as much leverage in the game. However, as I said, there's a lot of losses that are going to be taken. Now, by the way, back to Jay Powell a second in the Fed. Jay Powell came out of the private equity industry. So he's trying to save, to the extent that he can, the debt markets that fund corporate buyouts. So that's one of the reasons for buying all the high quality debt, is it forces people to invest in the junk debt that's originated as part of these buyouts.
You know, in Venezuela, the market basically was halted. You know, after a tremendous bull run, one of the biggest bull runs in the world is in Venezuela and Iran and other countries where the currency is collapsing. In Zimbabwe, excuse me, not Venezuela, but Zimbabwe, they simply turned the market off. And I've been saying now for a while that the private equity guys, and Jay Powell is one of them, and the guy from Bain Capital, Romney, right? The private equity guys in America, They use all this money from the Fed to take America private. They're doing a leveraged buyout on America. And once it's done, and it could be in the next 2 or 3 years, they'll simply shut the market. They'll say, markets, we own it all. Sorry, have a nice day. We now live in a monarchy, and you should have taken out your guillotine sooner. Have a nice day.
I think you're right in one respect that they're going to continue with the leverage buyout of America, of corporate America. I think that's going to continue. But I think there's enough robustness in our system that we still have enough small companies coming in that they can't quite shut down the market, as it were, completely, that we're actually going to continue to have a market. And unlike a Zimbabwe, I have a lot more faith in the American dollar because it's the reserve currency by default, i.e. we're the only ones that are really a military superpower, so we can enforce our policies and our laws. Other countries can't do that. I mean,
Right. Sounds like Rome in the 2nd century AD when they stopped paying their forces of the military and the empire collapsed. I think you're overestimating the U.S. dollar here. But anyway, Richard, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. And that is going to do it for this edition, special July 4th edition. Hope you have a great barbecue on July 4th and all that stuff. If you want to catch us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.